Hi, it is a pleasure to welcome all of you to the third in a series of online panel discussions by the Center for Study of Organized Hate on the subject of religious minorities and online hate and disinformation in South Asia. My name is Yash Sharma. I'm the lead researcher at CSOH and the moderator for today's event. Today's event is titled Minority Rights and Online Disinformation in Post-Hasina Bangladesh and is focused on addressing the topic of minority rights in Bangladesh, the role of social media platforms in amplifying disinformation and hate speech, and the influence of online disinformation efforts by Hindu nationalist leaders and supporters based in India. We have a panel of four experts with intimate knowledge of the region and experience researching today's subject matter. First, we have Zina Tasreen, who has been a journalist with the Daily Star, Bangladesh's leading English newspaper for 12 years. Zina was previously the business editor and is now a senior editor with the newspaper. Zina did her undergrad and master's in economics from the University of Warwick. As a senior editor, Zina deals with disinformation being generated from India on the treatment of minorities in Bangladesh post 5th August. Next, we have Shubhashish Deep, who is a fact checker and researcher with a particular focus on regional disinformation. He is also an educator dedicated to enhancing media and information literacy among teenagers in rural Bangladesh. We also have Michael Kugelman, who is the director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center. He's a leading specialist on the region and its relations with the United States. The editor or co-editor of 11 books, Michael has also written for the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and other publications, covering topics ranging from US policy in Afghanistan to terrorism, water, energy, and food security in the region. Olia Sun is a writer, thinker, and activist based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Currently a lecturer at the University of Liberal Arts Bangladesh and a tutor at Pathshala South Asian Media Institute. He's also a consultant at the National Curriculum and Textbook Board and serves as a language justice consultant for the Foundation for a Just Society. He's also the co-founder of Onushur and Bodhicitta, where his work centers on political liberation, exploring intersectional marginalities, anti-coloniality, and queerness. Thank you to all the panelists for joining us today. We will now have a set of opening remarks from all our panelists, followed by a dedicated round of discussion. We also have a round of Q&A based on questions that come in from the audience. So please feel free to send in your questions and we will do our best to address as many of them as possible. So firstly, coming to Zina, as one of the leading journalists
Yeah.
in Bangladesh, what are some of your observations around the coverage of the issue of minority rights and social media disinformation, both domestically and regionally since the overthrow of Hasina's regime?
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I would say the coverage in India has been off the charts. It felt like an alternate reality and had little resemblance to what was going on over in Bangladesh. I mean, right after Hasina fled to India, I mean, the social media and also the mainstream media started churning out this narrative that Bangladesh has become hostage to Islamic extremists and Hindus are being persecuted. And after that, but I'm not going to deny that there were attacks post 5th August and between 5th and 8th August, but it was more outpouring of anger towards supporters of Awami League. And coincidentally, Hindus or minorities were Awami League's vote banks, like Muslims are Congresses in India. So their properties and businesses became targets of attacks, but they weren't specifically targeted, but because of the religion. But the Indian media, this is what they broadcast and amplified, and I don't know, it just took a life of its own. But the reporting in Bangladesh, because we do not think along the religious lines, we were reporting on attacks on Army League supporters and not Hindus per se. So, but the Indian media, I mean, they wouldn't really acknowledge the fact that the attacks were because they were Army League supporters and would like to just emphasize that Hindus are under attack, they're not safe in Bangladesh. And after that, when law and order started taking, okay, I mean, after the interim government took charge, I mean, law and order started returning in Bangladesh. And the attacks on Awami League supporters, that it came down. But what happened was the foreign media their bureaus, they tend to be located in Delhi, and the bureau chiefs there, they were influenced by the narrative that was created in Indian media, and they would come over to Dhaka and specifically look for attacks on Hindus. So I'm going to cite a report by Bloomberg by Kai Schultz. He basically said that post-Hasina, Bangladesh has become open to Islamic extremists, and he cited sources, basically incidents that people in Bangladesh media didn't come across. So I would say I don't know how he got hold of those people. And also there was another report on New York Times with the headline Hindus Hindus under attack. Hindus in Bangladesh face attacks after Prime Minister's exit. I mean, in the report, they said that they couldn't independently verify the incidents. But the headline, I mean, that created all the damage. So yeah, I would say just what happened. And since then, it's a matter of catching up. I mean, Bangladeshi media, they haven't really focused on this issue of minority attacks, which is why whenever people Google, they do not find any Bangladeshi links. It's always the Indian links that would come on top of the search indexes. So yeah, that's all.
Thank as you have observed targeting religious minorities on social media during and after the overthrow of the Hasina government? And how significant is the role of misinformation and disinformation originating from India about attacks on Hindus in Bangladesh in shaping community relations?
Thank you, Yash. Thank you for inviting me here. And also, pardon my voice. I have got cold and uh, I lost my voice recently, but luckily it came back to the morning. So, the if you look at the narratives of you know regarding the disinformation narratives against the minority people. So I can divide this in two sectors. One is which goes, exaggerately in favor of the minorities, and one thing is goes against the minorities. So first thing, the main narrative that was spreading was the first focus was the whole revolution. It was a Islamist revolution, and Islamists took over the country. Now the you know minorities of the countries are in danger and they are being targeted. So that was the main focus, and to establish that, so there were a lot of different narratives coming from, like, the minorities, they are migrating to India, and they're actually forcefully migrated to the country. And another narrative was the forced conversion. So the Hindus, they are in a tense situation, so they have the fear of getting converted to the religion and everything. So that was the after 5th of August. So, and when the Indian media has circulated, Indian media, I mean the right-wing Indian media, they have circulated the disinformation against the vulnerability of the minorities. So it creates the tension, and these are the main narratives we have seen to debunk those misinformation. Now, if you ask me how significant the role, to shaping the interreligious relationship. So, we live in a region, South Asia is historically very vulnerable when it comes to religion. So this is already a tense situation. The sensitivity is always high, and people are religious and also very sensitive to their religion. So any information can misguide them, and which led to vulnerabilities. So there is always some internal and external ideas that can, increase the tension. So in this case, we have seen a lot of external ideas or external information coming from India, which is actually forcing or pressurizing the minorities in the country to take a side. Okay, so now they're in a position, now they have to choose a side. So most of the cases we have seen that in fact, the journalists to cover the real stories. So there are stories going on. So right, uh, like any other South Asian countries, Bangladesh has facing turbulence when it comes to religious, communal violences. So now the problem is the people are not sharing the actual incidents because of the fear of uh, getting picked by the Indian medias and exaggerating the whole fact. So it creates a tension in the country, and sometimes it helps to overlook the real incidents. So people are not talking about the real incidences, and medias are busy doing uh, uh, busy answering the misinformation coming from outside of the country. So it is actually a problematic situation, and we can talk about it further. Thank you, Yash.
Thank you. Now, Michael, how do you view the attempts by India and the Modi government in particular to mobilize the issue of Hindu persecution as a means to gain political leverage while also further polarizing the situation in Bangladesh?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. Thanks for putting together this event. This is such an important issue to discuss, a very sensitive one for sure, but I'm really glad that you're doing this. So, there's an argument that one could make here, a seemingly compelling argument, but I'm not sure that I entirely buy it. So let me explain. This argument would be that the Modi government sees a tantalizing political opportunity to seize on a lie and capitalize on it for political gain. And the argument would go like this. It makes great political sense for the Modi government through BJP linked or BJP friendly social media accounts in particular to concoct and propagate fake narratives about Bangladeshi Hindus being besieged. The BJP, as we all know, suffered a big setback in last year's parliamentary elections. India is dealing with inflation, unemployment. The opposition in India has been energized, and all this gives the Hindu nationalist government in India an incentive to try to fire up its base by bringing attention to the plight of Hindus in Bangladesh with these by sponsoring these disinformation campaigns. But I don't entirely buy this. I mean, for one thing, I think we're still taking postmortems of the Indian election results last year, why they ended up the way they did. But I think it's quite clear that one reason why the BJP underperformed electorally was that many voters had had enough of communal rhetoric and majoritarian policies, especially as those things did not address economic stress, which was chief on the minds of many Indian voters. Building more temples does not put more food on the table. Um, but I think the second and more fundamental reason why I push back on this argument that the BJP wants to leverage a lie for political reasons is that we're not talking about a complete lie. And here I would go back to what was mentioned before that there were some cases in those immediate days after Sheikh Hasina's ouster when Hindus in Bangladesh were threatened and in some cases attacked. There was some Bangladesh media coverage. I think an account from Protham Alo stands out in particular that chronicled a number of attacks on religious minorities, not just Hindus, religious minorities on the whole, post August 5th. And indeed, most of them part of the retributive violence that was playing out in those immediate days after Hasina's ouster. And you actually had some protests, as I recall, involving Bangladeshi Hindus demanding more security and protection. So something did happen, even if nowhere near on the scale depicted by the disinformation campaigns. And so the fact that you did have some cases of Hindus in Bangladesh being threatened and targeted, that reality triggered fear and concern in India. And I think that it's that anxiety in response to those incidents that did happen that has been exploited, perhaps for political effect by New Delhi through these wildly exaggerated and untruthful accounts of what's happening. And I should say as well that many in India, not just the government, are concerned by a variety of developments that have played out in Bangladesh since August 5th. And again, this is articulating India's concerns, the reemergence of pro-Pakistan political actors, the release of several militant leaders from prison who are deeply anti-India, and so on. And so I think that against this backdrop, the fact that Bangladeshi Hindus had faced some challenges and threats, and in some cases some attacks, and the fear that arises from that, that's a very powerful thing to exploit through these disinformation campaigns. Just a final note, and I doubt I'm the first person to make this observation. I think that these disinformation campaigns about atrocities against Hindus in Bangladesh could actually hurt Hindus in Bangladesh more than they help them. And that's because the more disinformation you churn out about alleged atrocities against Bangladeshi Hindus, once the fakeness of that news becomes clear, the more you run the risk that people will reflexively come to believe that anything they hear about atrocities or attacks or threats against Hindus in Bangladesh will have to be false. And that means that when you have actual incidents, if you were to have actual incidents, threats, attacks, anything on Hindus in Bangladesh, people may not believe it's true because so much of what they've heard has been false. So it's sort of like the boy who cried wolf effect. And I'd argue that we saw something very similar happen in Afghanistan after the Taliban came to power. Hundreds of social media accounts were posting images and allegations of Taliban abuses that didn't happen. But that meant that you had a higher risk of more people not believing the true, actual stories of Taliban abuse, of which there were quite a few. At any rate, I think the broader point is these disinformation campaigns can backfire for those that orchestrate them. So thank you. Back to you.
Thank you. That's really important. Now, earlier in your experience of working in the education sector, how do you view the role of social media in influencing youth political discourse in the country, particularly around the issue of minority rights?
Thank you, Yash. Yash, thank you for putting this together. And I think, and this is the case, I think, for all over subcontinent, that people are primarily sourcing their information from social media. So that also applies to students, youngsters. They're mostly sourcing all their information primarily from social media, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, X, you name it. And what that means is there is a growing online market of news, which is being capitalized, used by not just established media institutions, but also by other actors. And at the same time, because we are using these platforms, there are also companies, global companies, which also have certain agendas, mechanisms of censorship, community guidelines, and whatnot. They are also capitalizing on the very same issue. So when I really look at the kind of the situation, I see this as a sort of an intricate network of international, national, and transnational actors who have differing interests, and all of those are culminating into this different kind of factions, uh, and I think resulting in social bubbles within social media. So we have, I think, like students who are perhaps from a particular class group or maybe from a particular social group are actually subscribing to news sources which are confirming to their already existing views. So that creates this kind of mechanisms of disconnections where we have a class and there is already divisions between different groups in terms of what they think about what's going on. And particularly, I think, around minority rights. And I think, there are kinds of minorities, and I think primarily for India, only Hindu, but we also have other minorities. For example, there are Christians, there are Buddhists, and what sort of implications for that is actually, and the situation there is also quite intense. And I think, we all talk about post August 5th, what's the status of minorities in Bangladesh, but I would go back. It did not start after August 5th. Even in 2023 or 2021, one of the biggest incidents of this kind of communal violence that we have witnessed in Bangladesh, where Muslim mobs were attacking temples like during a Durga Puja festival, and more than 50 temples were vandalized all across Bangladesh, and this happened under the Awami League regime. So And I think, let's sort of, I think our perception and understanding of what minority rights mean and what protection looks like and what danger looks like is something that we have to revisit, because, Awaमी League's own stance around minority rights was that there was a complete failure. And we realized that even more when you actually look at the consequences and the after effects of those violence. I mean, if you look back, most of these cases of violence were not even investigated, let alone getting resolved through a due procedure. So, which means the kind of involvement of different power groups in orchestrating this violence. And, I would again stress on that fact that not all groups have the power to actually, commit a, an act of violence. So there's definitely an issue of power here of different, I think, warring social groups as well. So that's one of the, I think, biggest concerns. But I think one of the less talked about issue is actually the situation in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, where many of our indigenous groups are primarily living. And we have witnessed multiple campaigns, both online and offline, because it's also a highly militarized area. And that's, again, before and after August 5th. And there, in fact, were several incidents of communal violence between the Bengali settlers and the indigenous communities there. And those were not even reported by our traditional established media houses. So that situation is actually there. And, we see a very different kind of responses there, and particularly that affected the understanding of a larger sect of the population. So if you ask about, I think, Hindus in Bangladesh, most people are aware of the fact that there are disinformation campaigns going on in India about the current state of Hindus. But if you ask them about what's the current state of the indigenous communities in Bangladesh, you will get very different kind of responses, because that's where the pitfall lies. And I've seen that in sort of, I think, in different social circles. And also the queer communities or the sexual diverse communities in Bangladesh have also been put on the line. And this is, again, I would again stress on the fact that this all started before August 5th. And during the whole Awaमी League regime, we have one of the biggest incident, one of the killings of one of the queer activists, two queer activists, in fact. And that also happened during the army regime, and it took years for them to actually process the culprits and hold them accountable. So when I really look at the situation, I don't see these things like taking place out of the blue. And of course, I mean, you have different social actors, and when you don't really have a functioning law and justice system, a lot of things would definitely escalate, and I think understandably so. But the kind of responses that we have witnessed, and if I really look, kind of compare the amount of violence that we have witnessed before, and if I compare that, I don't really think it yields or requires the kind of responses that we have received from the Indian media in particular at this particular moment. I mean, if you're genuinely concerned about minority rights in Bangladesh, they could have held Awami League accountable, which they did not. I mean, politically, diplomatically, etc., that did not happen. So I really don't think that's coming from that sort of perception. But and student groups, and I think in Bangladesh we have had the July uprising primarily being orchestrated and organized through social media platforms, and that's why internet was shut down. And if you really look at the intensity of the movement also kind of slowed down when the shutdown took place, and then it again came back full force after they were forced to resume the internet connections back. So we do see the kind of power of social media and online platforms and the different kinds of uses, and that also includes getting away from, I think, surveillance techniques and organizing differently through Telegram groups, which was because there were many fake pages that were being created on social media platforms, particularly Facebook, Instagram, and therefore the student groups actually created Telegram groups so that you can source authentic information from a particular source. So there are all interesting kind of uses there. So but I think that already only highlights the importance that youth groups, particularly youngsters, are also sourcing their news from social media, and they're big consumers, which means it comes with all kinds of consequences. But I would sort of, I think, veer back to the fact that I think to actually ensure and address the issues, we actually need ground mechanisms, which is a functioning, I think, justice system that is necessary for us to deal with all these issues properly. So yes, I'll stop there, and then of course we'll take more questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's really critical to keep the kind of wider historical as well as socio-political perspective that you brought for us. Before moving on to a further round of questions, I wanted to remind the audience that we'll have time for a Q&A once all panelists have had a chance to respond to the questions. So please feel free to send in any questions that you have for any of our panelists. Now, moving on, Zina, I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, how crucial is the mitigation of political polarization within the wider project of establishing long-term political stability in Bangladesh?
I would say it's, yeah, I, yeah, I would say it's absolutely vital that the political polarization is mitigated. And that has to start with the Awami League. I mean, there has to be some redress. I mean, so far, I mean, we haven't seen any signs of Army League feeling any sense of remorse over what happened in the months of July and August, and also over the past 15 years. So we can't really move forward if they don't acknowledge it. And in fact, what we are seeing is the Sheikh Hasina, while sitting in Delhi, she's instructing her men in Bangladesh to destabilize the government. She's coming up with all sorts of instructions, and which are anti-state activities, I would say. And her men are actually following through on that. So, I mean, that has to stop. And also, I mean, India has to also acknowledge that what has happened in July and August, all the lives lost. I mean, India also has to acknowledge that what happened was not right. And yeah, the Indian government, even though it has said that they would work with the government of the day, but I mean, they need to walk the talk, and that starts with stopping the disinformation and also stressing on Hindu rights in every discourse, every discussions. I mean, Hindus are fine in Bangladesh. I mean, once the Indian government acknowledges this, I mean, we can move forward. So yeah, I would say it's very it's vital political neutralization, and also the Indian, I mean, the interim government has done all it could to make Hindus feel safe. I mean, there have been 88 people. 70 people have been arrested in 88 cases in connection to Hindu attacks. So the Indian government has to acknowledge that, take it into consideration, and just stop stressing on that matter, I would say. And also, I mean, the Indian government needs to distance itself from the Awami League, because there is a greater sentiment among the Bangladeshi masses that, I mean, Hasina could stay for as long as she did. It's because of unqualified backing from the Indian government. So yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Zina. Now, following on from that, Michael, given India's pronounced support for the Hasina government, where do you see the scope for India-Bangladesh bilateral relations going forward and its impact across the wider South Asian region?
Yeah, thanks. Tough to know how this relationship will play out moving forward, and I think over the longer term we'll have some more clarity only after Bangladesh has elections, and the time frame for those elections is still a bit unclear. I think it's also worth noting that while it's true that the relationship has really suffered since the ouster of Sheikh Hasina, let's keep in mind that India-Bangladesh relations did face some challenges even in the Hasina era over longstanding tension points like the Teesta River issue, border security, and the issue of public sentiment. Bangladesh public sentiment often critical of Indian policies, especially in the Modi era. But with those caveats in mind, turning to the relationship's possible evolution in the coming weeks and months, I think there are two possible extreme scenarios, and I don't think either of those will play out. One extreme scenario is that India simply buries the hatchet and decides to focus fully on building out a partnership with the new leadership. I think that's highly unlikely given all the issues on both sides. The other extreme scenario is that New Delhi essentially rejects the new setup in Dhaka and suspends relations or covertly works to foment internal resistance to the interim government. Don't think that's likely either, as it seems quite clear that New Delhi has not rejected the government and it's kept high-level communication channels open. What I think is most likely is that New Delhi will proceed cautiously, pursuing cooperation with Dhaka where possible and distancing itself from Dhaka in other areas. So I think that trade and commercial cooperation will likely continue, for example. But I think there could be some red lines for India. One is if Jamaat were to become a formal part of of a government in Bangladesh. Another is if Bangladesh were to open up military cooperation with Pakistan in a big way. There were some, speaking of fake news, there were some Indian media reports the other day claiming that Pakistani soldiers will soon go to Bangladesh to train Bangladeshi forces. I don't think that news is accurate based on my understanding. But we are seeing indications of warming ties between Bangladesh and Pakistan. But as I said before, India has made it clear that it wants to try to salvage the relationship. Communication channels are open. There have been high-level meetings, including on the foreign minister level. After the Indian foreign secretary visited Dhaka last month, New Delhi was telegraphing, at least publicly, positive messages about wanting to make things work. And for all the talk of India having lost leverage over Dhaka, with its only preferred leader and party out of the picture now, it still has options. I mean, I think that the army in Bangladesh could be a useful interlocutor for New Delhi to convey its concerns and interests. The army is not anti-India or anything like that. The army chief, as we all know, in an interview the other day in the Bangladeshi press, he spoke very positively about ties with India, more positively than Dr. Yunus and his advisors have spoken about India. I think that the BNP party could become potentially a more palatable interlocutor for New Delhi if it distanced itself from Jamaat, which it's sort of signaled that it would want to do, whether that's true or not. But I think that the issue of public sentiment in Bangladesh will remain an issue for India-Bangladesh relations. The heavy criticism and indeed some of the anti-India sentiment that we see there. I think New Delhi will need to be careful not to be giving the appearance of continuing to meddle and interfere. If that perception is there, I think that the anti-India sentiment will be hard pressed to recede, and that could have negative implications for the wider relationship. Honestly, I think that the issue of stability may prove to be the most compelling motivation for maintaining cooperation. Both India and Bangladesh worry about spillover effects from the conflict in Myanmar, which has, of course, as we all know, seen rebel takeovers of large amounts of territory in border areas. I think that it would be easier for India and Bangladesh to manage these stability concerns emanating from Myanmar if India and Bangladesh have a more workable relationship. It would be easier to have delicate discussions about how to address the possible consequences of Myanmar's war, whether border security related or refugee flows or narcotics trade or whatever may be the case. If the India-Bangladesh relationship is in a better place, those discussions will be easier to have. So, with that, back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the role of the army is particularly intriguing in this setup, especially given the political history of Bangladesh. Now, Shubhashish, what are some of the steps that the interim government can take to address the concerns around minority rights? And what role potentially can social media companies play in helping address disinformation online?
Okay, thank you. Uh, so I think interim government can do a lot of things, but in my understanding, they can start with maybe the enforcing law first. For example, not just as Oliver San has said, not just after 5th of August, we have seen these sort of actions happen before that. Okay, so but most of the cases we did not see anything, from the government side, any action has took their, or there maybe the interim government can start with the, uh, bringing those culprit under the law. Okay, whoever doing this or that. Bangladesh has blasphemy law. Okay, so now the problem is, uh, but luckily, Indian government has took some actions recently. Incident happened in Sunamganj, Sylhet. So they have took four accused under the law. So this is one thing. It can start with this, and then I think this issue is so complicated that not only law can, by enforcing law, it will not vanish. The dialogue is most important part here. Okay, so there has to be dialogue between all the stakeholders out there. So to start the dialogue, you have to know the reason. So what triggers the incident like this in Bangladesh? Okay, so most of the cases, it is not something, uh, it is not that complicated to understand. If you look at the cases happened, last 5 years, you'll get the answer. Most of the cases, the incident is blasphemy. Okay, maybe someone has posted something online, or maybe someone insulting the sentiment of the majority, and they start collaborating, and with a mob they start vandalizing the places. So now, if you know the reason, now it is, you can stop this. Like, you can have a conversation with the people from the rural areas. The problem is, we are uh, we are very all the dialogues are happening in Dhaka, but most of the cases, most of the problems happening in the rural areas, but we're not going there, right? So the problem is, this is the situation, so we cannot handle the whole thing from the Dhaka. I think we have to bring the stakeholders from the rural areas, talk to them, and maybe understand why this happens. And since I said, there is a blasphemy law, so if someone posted something online, maybe he can be arrested. So it is debatable, the blasphemous law, but still there is a law, and we can put them in the trap. And now the second part is what social media can do. Uh, Social media can do a lot of things, but maybe they can start with what they do best, maybe content moderation. So if you look at the Bangladesh regions, you will see most of the disinformation has generated from YouTube. YouTube is the place which generates most of the content. But if you look at the YouTube side, so there is no fact checking unit in YouTube. YouTube doesn't fact check. They have a community standard rule, but it is not that effective, I would say. And then Facebook, they have the 3PFC, I mean the fact-checking unit, and maybe some other gatekeeping, yeah, but it is not that effective when it comes to stop the violation. So what they can do, the problem is, most of the social media outlets, they are heavily rely on artificial intelligences when it comes to content moderation. So but the problem is, AI maybe the problem is, the AI is not that efficient when it comes to Bengali or other languages. It is efficient for English, but it is not that efficient for Bangla. So now, when you are trying to moderate the whole contents by AI, the problem remains, and it cannot, identify the harmful contents. For example, if you can say the black word in Bangla, it may be 3 or 4 voices, like, and the AI doesn't understand that thing. So they understand only one word, and they put strike on that word. But the other uh, harm is remain as such. So this is how it can be, decreased maybe to some extent. But again, they have to start from content moderation, and maybe what they should focus on the human intervention, not solely focus on the AI. So maybe they can bring the stakeholders from the countries and get take the ideas from there. And this is how human intervention is, I think, by far the only way. So it can be mitigated, and other can be. Thank you, Yash.
Thank you, Shivashish. Now, earlier moving on to What role have civil society organizations played in addressing the issue of online disinformation and ensuring greater community supports towards ethnic, religious, as well as sexual minorities in Bangladesh?
I think in terms of addressing issues of online disinformation campaigns emanating from India, there we have seen several conversations, dialogues within civil societies, and also quite a few number of public dialogues as well, organized by civil society actors. But in terms of, I think, ensuring community support, we haven't seen that much of an effort, I would say, particularly when attacks like I think maybe some kind of communal attack would happen. And then usually what would happen is some civil society organization would actually go there, uh, have and speak to the communities. We do have some independent initiatives which have done that when such incidents were addressed, and those are continuing. But I wouldn't say it was a large scale mobilization which would otherwise have taken place, like we have seen during the cases of 2021, and also in cases, attacks in Dinajpur, in some parts of Sylhet as well. And we've seen usually, civil society actors will come up, will go there, speak to the communities, try to, really address their grievances. But I think in this particular case, we have not been able to do that for a number of reasons. I think one of that it would be pertaining to, I think, just the matters of national security, because the police actually fled the scenes, if I may put it like that, because they were one of the primary actors which were orchestrating the violence. So the first step was actually for them to just leave their stations, which means all the police stations were empty. And that also gave rise to, just petty crimes. Like there are petty criminals all over the country. So they also got an opportunity to come up and do what they wanted to do. So that's one thing. I think, but a civil society organization could actually play I think, a stronger role, and also the government could actually, I think, could have played a stronger role. But I think they were. Still trying to stabilize themselves because there is so much mounting pressure internationally, nationally, from all sides. So they were heavily pressured, but I think nonetheless they could still do a lot, in fact, to quell these tensions, to really bridge these gaps. And we have seen that happening. In fact, the interim government actually held a meeting with different religious groups, different religious leaders very recently. So there are some initiatives that they're taking in, but that need to be, I think, there's actually remains a lot to be done from civil society organizations' perspectives, because we don't really have witnessed a large-scale social mobilizations where different religious groups are coming together, trying to bridge these gaps, trying to address these information campaigns together. We have not really seen those kind of coalitions being formed. And going back, I would like to, I think, slightly correct Michael, because I think the issue of BNP and Jamaat that Michael was mentioning, BNP and Jamaat actually have already parted ways, and they have already parted ways before the fall of the regime. So now they're not part of the same coalition. Now BNP and Jamaat are actually, in fact, there is a growing tension between these two groups, and they're almost acting like competitors. And that has already started because they are not part of the same coalition anymore. And I think this will be a very big factor in the upcoming elections, where BNP and Jamaat will actually compete against each other. And there is a lot of community and political community building that are already sort of started. So just to correct that fact. But again, going back to the point of the role of civil society organizations, I think we have a lot to do in terms of addressing these issues. And particularly, I would also want to focus on the issue of minority rights, sexual minority rights, because back in December 2023, before the elections, the last elections that we have had after through which Sheikh Hasina came to power, last time, we have seen a large-scale mobilizations against sexual minorities, particularly online, through online disinformation campaigns. And that has jeopardized their security. There were attacks. There were, in fact, negative social reactions. In various sources, we've also had an increased rate of suicides in sexual minority communities, which would usually go unreported. And that happened, that started back in December 2023. And after August 5th, we see the same kind of groups are, they remain intact, and they're again coming up with a new kind of campaigns targeting sexual minorities. So, and that we haven't been able to do that much I would say, when as civil society organizations, many have actually failed them. So there actually remains a lot to be done, because we are focusing on, I think, and I think the majority and minority dynamic also plays in within minority settings, where we are actually focusing on the majority minority, I mean large minority groups, and then you tend to ignore smaller minority groups. I think that dynamic is also there, and that's where I think civil society organizations need to play a very stronger role that they have not been, and they have not been able to play. And I would also I think take into account the role of media in Bangladesh, and I would argue it has not really changed that much in terms of tendencies, in terms of operational techniques, in terms of coverage, in terms of how you address and highlight issues. So that also needs to be revised, I think, because they also act as civil society actors. So yes, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you. Now, before we move on to the audience Q&A, I wanted to, partly take advantage of my moderator privileges as well as someone who works on Hindu nationalist political discourse in India, point to a couple of things which, again, relate to a lot of the observations we've had. One thing we saw in India, I think, which is important to note, is that immediately in the aftermath of the events of August 5, is that what the BJP and a lot of Hindu nationalist groups try to do is use the incident, irrespective of the reality of the violence faced by Hindu community, as a cause for greater Hindu political consolidations domestically. So, for example, one of the rallying cries of the BJP in the past few months, particularly in the two state elections in Maharashtra and Jharkhand, was "Batoge to Katoge," which was given by Yogi Adityanath, the firebrand chief minister of Uttar Pradesh and a Hindu nationalist ideologue, which translates to basically, if you are divided, you will be slaughtered, which was a reference to supposed events happening in Bangladesh, and therefore using that as a way to argue that BJP is the only political party in India which can provide you that kind of safety and security against this threat of Islamist invasion or other kind of attacks, and that fear can exist domestically as well. And secondly, what the BJP also tried to do, and again, I think alluding to Michael's comments earlier, the results and consequences of this discourse are unclear as of now, because in Jharkhand election particularly, and we at CSOH have done multiple briefs on the topic for those who are interested, is that they try to use the narrative of the infiltrator, both the Bangladeshi infiltrator, so to say, as well as the Rohingya infiltrator, which is linked to someone coming from Bangladesh and India, as individuals who are coming into India, and are being supported by the opposition party, in this case, the Congress and others, and they're taking over resources, they're accessing social welfare measures, etc. And and that was a coded message in one part to target Muslims from Bengal who are Indian citizens, but by equating them through the religious angles as Bangladeshi infiltrators, Hindu nationalists have really tried to play up this narrative. And these are some of the things we're looking at, as well as in our annual hate speech report the center compiles, which will be out sometime later this month, so for everyone to look out on. And again, like alluding to Michael's point, the BJP handsomely lost the Jharkhand elections versus Maharashtra, where this narrative wasn't played as much. So it's unclear how much the BJP will use this going forward, but we've seen a clear consequence of the events in Bangladesh trickling also into domestic political discourse in India. Now, coming to the audience, and thank you so much for sending in your questions. One of the two actually combining two questions that we have had, and I was wondering, Michael, if you could speak to this to some degree. We have someone asking, what do you think about organizations like COHNA, I think, which is the Council of Hindus in North America, spreading misinformation and holding membership drives on the strength of this attack on Hindu narratives? And is there any attempt to show up their lives in the context of India's own shameful treatment of minorities? And this is linked to another question where someone was asking about the role of diaspora in third party countries such as the United States and other parts of Europe, where there is any effort to either counter this disinformation or it's being used by the diaspora community, Hindu nationalist diaspora communities.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this is an important question. I think for me, what really stands out, well, first of all, to the question of, is it possible to try to push back against these groups by bringing attention to India's treatments of its minorities? This does not work, because these groups either deny that minorities are treated poorly in India, or they essentially acknowledge that it doesn't matter because what's happening in Bangladesh is worse. So, getting to the broader part of the question, for me, what's most concerning about groups like the one that's mentioned, as well as others here in the US, is that you have the risk that these groups, some of which are quite politically active and influential, could convey these messages, these fake, these disinformation campaigns to policymakers in the US, where they're talking about members of Congress or whatever the case may be. And I think that we saw this very vividly some weeks ago. I'm sure we all remember this. I can't remember the name of the group, but it was a Hindu American advocacy group that had essentially advocated to the Trump team for quite some time to try to get Donald Trump to weigh in on the what's happening in Bangladesh. And so we saw, I guess it was a tweet from Trump some time ago where he essentially said that Hindus are being besieged in Bangladesh. The narrative coming from these groups. And you had a leader of one of these groups that actually took credit for this advocacy effort. So here's a case of the incoming president of the United States posting a message on social media, which is essentially reflecting these extremely damaging disinformation campaigns, which have come from India, but also from some of these groups in the United States and North America. So I think that's where the biggest concern lies. It's not just the fact that you have multiple groups that are coming out with this disinformation, and it's happening in the United States. I can't speak for what's happening elsewhere in North America, but the fact that this is able to evolve to the point where you have those in power that are being exposed to these types of narratives, that I think is, for me, what stands out the most, and what needs a bigger discussion about how to address that challenge.
Thank you. And I think there's a similar challenge also domestically in India, because I think even domestically, if political parties and civil society groups have wanted to highlight the kind of misuse of this narrative by the Hindu nationalists, they've been confronted by what everyone has said earlier, in the sense that there's no smoke without fire. There have been incidents of targeting. Now, the purpose might be unclear, the systematic nature of these attacks might be unclear, but the fact that these incidents have existed has meant that a lot of other political parties, for example, the Communist Party, or multiple parties that are vehemently ideologically opposed to the BJP, have not come out and been able to call out the BJP. They've also made statements saying we want the Bangladeshi government to acknowledge these attacks against Hindus. So the domestic situation in India is also complicated by a lot of these similar factors. And again, like to highlight and like complement a lot of what Michael has said, our center is also working right now on a report which looks at these kind of transnational far-right networks, especially how a lot of narratives within the Indian domestic sphere are being amplified by those in the West and building into these ideas of love jihad and how they relate to great replacement theory. So I would urge a lot of the people in the audience to look out for upcoming reports by the center. Now, another question which I wanted some input from both Shubhashish and Zina. So one, and let me get the name wrong. Nayanika, yeah. Nayanika is someone who's worked extensively in Bangladesh, and their question relates to the comment that Shubhashish made earlier, that as a result of like the media coverage, there are certain incidents which are happening which are not being paid as much attention to. And they want to know that what are some of the details about these incidents and how are they being missed, as well as how can we focus on the disinformation aspect of it without making sure it's appropriated. And that relates to a question I had for you, Zina, which is also how
Okay.
like traditional media in Bangladesh is navigating these issues, where there are elements of disinformation, but there are also elements of incidents that are targeting individuals. So how is traditional media countering some of these? So either of you can go first.
Do I go first? Okay, I'll go first. So the tradition, basically, there is no anti-India sentiment amongst the traditional media. We're trying to be as thorough as possible. I mean, whenever we see any reports on social media of Hindu or any minority attacks, we do send our correspondents to verify. But often, it's that we see that the issue is completely different. And yeah, I mean, it's a case of catching up for us, because the speed at which the disinformation is coming from breathless. I mean, we do not have the resources. I mean, Bangladesh is a large country. I mean, it's a nation. Our population is 170 million. And if one person gets attacked, I mean, it is not possible. And I mean, if it's in large centers, I mean, sure, I mean, it would have been widely reported. But many of these incidents, they're in some remote part of Bangladesh where it's not possible for traditional media to reach right away. But I mean, I can assure you that there is no anti-Hindu sentiment amongst the traditional media. We do want to report on their issues and we do want to highlight it. And the interim government is also sincere about it. And I would say political party, at least I can speak for BNP and their like-minded parties. I mean, they also want to, take into consideration the issues of minorities. And I would de facto leader, Mr. Tariq Rahman now, he said that, in his Bangladesh, there wouldn't be any such thing as minority. Everyone's an equal. So I would say that is the view of the traditional media as well. So I don't know if that answers the question.
So, okay, but I want to add something with that. So, what was my point was, if I give an example to that, for example, a few days ago, Anandobajar Putrika, so they have reported an incident that happened in Netrogona, Bangladesh, in some place of Netrogona. So obviously they have exaggerated the whole thing. So they have said that Hindu's house has been attacked and everything. So now what the mainstream media, one of the mainstream media from Bangladesh, what they have done is, so they went to the Netrogona to investigate the whole thing, but they went to a wrong part of the Netrogona. So where the incident took place, they did not go there. They went to a different place and said that, see, this is nothing happening there. A house has been burned, but it was for a different cause. So there is no, minority attack or everything. So maybe the intention was good. So they tried to investigate the whole thing, but the problem is the volume of disinformation coming from the India is so high that they are being puzzled. So it was a mistake. So now the problem is who the real victim. So they've been missed. The mass media did not cover the real incident that happened in there, right? So that was the thing. The intention was there. So the mainstream houses, they want to portray the real scenario from the country, but they are they cannot fight against the volume of the information coming from India. So this is the goal.
Yeah, I would say that India, is the Vishwaguru of misinformation, and it's absolutely not possible for traditional media, or I don't know if it's not possible for media of any country to combat that.
Thank you. And I think with that, we've come to an end of this panel discussion. I want to thank everyone in the audience who took out the time to attend today's panel discussion on this critical topic. I also want to extend my gratitude to today's panelists who've been kind enough to share their expertise and opinion with us. I wanted to inform all of you that we at CSOH are working on various reports and panel discussions on minority across South Asia, as I mentioned. We also have an upcoming panel discussion on how the international community can support girls' education in Afghanistan. Details about the event, as well as other stuff, can be found on our various social media handles such as Instagram, Facebook, X, LinkedIn, and TikTok, where we go by the handle CSO Hate. We would also like you to invite you to join our mailing list, where we regularly post about upcoming events, reports, published pieces, as well as collaborations. Thank you so much for attending today's events and a good day
Thank,
to all of you.
Thank you,
thank
Yash.
you. Bye.